Hi, I'm Alex Underwood. We're here at Empire Ink Tattoo Studios in Glasgow. Today I'm going to show you how to tattoo in a Blackwork illustrative style. I'll be tattooing a raccoon with some graphic elements. Let's go! Okay guys, so I'm going to run you through my workstation. I use Pantera green soap, just a little Sharpie here, a razor, some scissors for the stencil stuff for the stencil application. I use my Cheyenne Thunder. And today I'll be using 3 different needles. I've got Cheyenne 3-round liner, got Bishop 11-round Magnum. We've also got the Killer Ink 14-round liner, as well as 3 ink pots. I use the silicone ink pots because it helps with the needles. I use Eclipse Black Tattoo Ink and also 2 grey washes. Fusion medium tone and Fusion light. Okay guys, that's everything in my workstation. Let's get cracking. Okay, so the first thing I do is prep the skin. Just wanting to wipe the skin with an alcohol wipe. It just helps to cleanse the area and also degrease the skin, which allows the stencil to stick more easy. And now we're gonna shave any little hairs that are there. I always shave down the way because you risk cutting open the skin if you shave up the way on a leg. Okay, that looks good. Now I'm just going to place the stencil over the skin to see where I want to put it. I want to keep any details away from areas like the knee, where it doesn't really take the details that well. That looks good, so maybe up slightly. Right, so now I'm going to mark the stencil in place because I like where I've put it. I think it flows very nicely with the body. Okay, so stencil stuff on the hand, and that way I can control how much goes onto the skin. Okay, I think we've got pretty even coverage. So now I'm going to line up the stencil and place it on. First I match up the bottom marking, then the top, and then I'll flatten the central part out first and sweep across to the edges so that there's no double lines on the stencil. Okay, now careful stencil reveal. So now I'll just pat the area dry. The faster the stencil heals, the quicker I can get to tattooing. Okay, now that the stencil's on, I'm going to ask my client if she likes the placement, and if so, we can crack on with the tattooing stage. Okay, so I'm going to start at the bottom of the tattoo. I usually start at the bottom and then work my way up. I feel like it's just easier to cope with mentally, and it's less confusing. But it does mean that I'm doing a lot of techniques all at once, so I don't do outlines and then shading. It's everything all at once, basically. Yeah, so I'm using a Cheyenne Hawk Thunder with the Cheyenne 3RL cartridges. It's the 0.25 gauge, which means they're very tight, very fine. But because the puncture point is so small, it means that it causes much less trauma to the skin, so I can go back and forward over an area of shading multiple times without it going overly red. And this texture I'm doing just now is called stipple texture. It's basically, instead of shading with a mag, you're shading with dots. And you're just stacking those dots on top of each other until you create the tone that you're after. So I'll go one way with the machine and then drag it in another direction, just so that you're getting a nice random arrangement of dots and there's no liney bits where there shouldn't be lines. Okay, so now I'm going to go in and do this sort of textured sketchy line. For this kind of line I'm using very low volts. The volts are 4.5, and I'm basically using a pushing motion and irregular depth. I'm not trying to maintain a consistent depth because I want the line to look old and sketchy and graphic. Sometimes that means building up over areas that you've already done just to increase the texture in that area. And I like these sketchy lines because they just add a little bit more intrigue to the tattoo as a whole. Okay, so for this area here, it's solid black and you can use a mag to obviously fill this, but it's also possible to fill it with a 3. And all you need to do is apply firm pressure and keep your wrist moving in a restricted fashion. You don't want big long swings, just nice and tight over and over. And again, different directions will create deeper value. So instead of a solid black, you get a sort of solid textured black. And I think it looks really, really nice and definitely complements this type of design. So yeah, nice sporadic movements of the needle, firm pressure, and eventually you'll get a nice fully saturated area of black that still retains texture. Okay, so some lines are very superficial in the skin. I don't want them to heal bold, so when I make these lines, it's a very light pressure, and I'm basically just grazing the very top layer of the skin. I like when there's a nice contrast between bold lines and thin sketchy lines. Okay, so I'm using the anchor point of this line that comes across this area of shading to flick the needle upwards, and when I'm flicking, I'm also lifting the end of the needle so that the shading becomes more tapered and lighter as it's lifted out of the skin, and that creates a nice little gradient. Even though it's only a little space that we're working with, we can still achieve gradients with stipple textures. I've always been interested in like pointillism and like fine art pointillism styles, and yeah, for tattoos it's quite a forgiving style because you have a lot of chances to build tones and texture. With mag, sometimes it's 2 or 3 passes and then that's it. You can't go over that area of skin anymore in case you start to overwork, chew up the area. So with stippling it's much more forgiving because you're working at a lower voltage, but also because you're working with a 3RL and the puncture points are a lot finer, so the trauma to the skin is definitely decreased. But also I just love that gritty texture in the skin. I think it looks really sick. Okay, so when you're doing stipple, you want to keep your hand nice and relaxed. It's just a natural wrist motion with weaker pressure. You don't want firm pressure unless you're wanting heavily saturated areas of black like this area. But for this area that I'm doing just now, I just want sort of a mid-tone coverage. And what I'm doing is I'm just sweeping back and forward very lightly over the skin, maintaining the same pressure throughout. And because I have a hard line here, I'm not going to outline it, I'm actually just going to dig the needle in and pull downwards. And that will help to sort of create a structure along this line that isn't a bold outline. Again, going back and forward, creating that initial tone, and then digging the needle and pulling it back. And you don't want to be too slow with your hand motions either. The slower you are, the more of a line you'll get. Stipple is achieved with fast hand, quick motions. It definitely is a slower technique. You have to build and build just to create any kind of tone, but the outcome is really satisfying. And you'll know if you're the right depth because you'll hear this sort of ticking noise of the needle traveling over the skin. It's like ASMR to me now. I want this part of the shading to be quite light, so I'm actually stippling with a grey wash. It goes in dark enough, but as it ages you'll see that it heals up nice and light, like a mag shading would. And it's all about creating that density again. I don't want too much density down the bottom of this shape, I only want it in the upper area, just so we get some definition but not too defined. There's still a nice softness to the shade. Yeah, so you can use a lot of different techniques to implant your dots. I think hardest is the pendulum technique. It's gradually sweeping the needle into the skin and then pulling it back out. This technique is quite hard because you can create lines with it, and if you're not planning on any lines in an area, then it's really hard to correct the shading and make it random again. Yeah, scratching across the surface, just very superficially, layering and layering will really help to create value in your tattoo. And texture as well. You can sort of soften the texture by going over some areas with a magnum, and it just sort of decreases the severity of the dots. So this machine has a 0.4 stroke, so it definitely is a punchy machine, which is good because you have nice defined dots, and sometimes it can just be a little bit too defined. So if you go back over with a magnum with maybe a light grey wash or something like that, you can soften up an area, and it also helps to blend out gradients and stuff. So I like to hang my needles out quite far, between 3 and 4 millimeters, so it's basically the maximum that you can hang the needle out of a Cheyenne Thunder. And I do this because it helps with crispness and accuracy. If I can see where exactly I'm pushing the needle into the skin, then I'm not going to have any surprises when I lift the needle back up and see where I've actually tattooed. I can see it as it's getting tattooed in real time. So yeah, sticking the needle out definitely improves overall sharpness and accuracy. So if you're an artist that maybe hasn't started working on real skin yet, you're still on your practice skins, there really is no way for you to prepare fully for the texture of real skin. And you'll find pretty quickly that each person that you tattoo has a different texture of skin, so you're constantly adjusting to how their skin works with the needles. But I would say that to make it a smoother experience for yourself, I would use obviously a good quality machine, good quality needles, and also butter to help your needle penetrate the skin without resistance. Because when I was an apprentice, I found that a lot of my tattoos, the lines were healing all funny and not totally saturated, so I ended up realising that it was a problem with how my needle was entering the skin. It was quickly damaging the skin because I didn't really know what I was doing, but also there was too much resistance from the skin that the needle actually wasn't depositing the ink correctly. So just make sure that you've got some Vaseline or some kind of processed butter on hand where you can just put a little bit on the skin, and you'll find that your needles go in much more smoothly. So these little lines on the side, they're purely just a little sketchy shape. I'm doing them with a grey wash because I don't want them to bleed together over time. I just want them to heal nice and light, and as an added feature in the design. I don't want anything too harsh, especially in the background, because I want the raccoon to stand out more, and if I'm doing everything too dark and too bold, then it's going to distract away from the main central focus point, which is the raccoon. Okay, so I'm switching over to an 11 round Magnum with a sort of medium needle hang, not too much needle hang, not as much as the 3RL anyway, because I'm wanting a fuller pigment saturation, and sometimes you can't, achieve that when your needle's sticking out too much. The ink has too far to travel, so it doesn't really implant into the skin as heavy as you would like it to. Yeah, you can go small circular motions or back and forward, but it is a constant contact with the needle on the skin. So I'm just creating the general depth in this little piece on the tattoo, which is similar to one of these pieces over here where it's just a splodge of ink. But to save time, instead of doing it with the 3, I'm going to go in with the mag and just fill out most of the black, and that looks pretty good to me. Nice saturation. So now I'm going to go back with the 3 and sort of add a lot of texture to the edges so that it's not a smooth looking shape. I want it gritty, graphic. So I'm going to turn my volts back down from 5.5, which is what I was using with the mag, back to 4.5, just so that I can get a slower needle speed, which helps it obviously create more dots, more texture. Okay, I'm going to go over this area with the Magnum just to soften up the texture of the dots and create a darker depth on this upper part of the shape. I don't want too much texture down the bottom because there's going to be a lot of texture within the raccoon itself. I'm just whipping over the shade, and you'll hear that noise, it means you're doing it right. You can also pull down from that upper line without making it a line. You don't want to do that. And the pressure shouldn't be too firm, it should be quite light still, because you're wanting to make a nice blend into the dots. Going to do the same in this bit, just so that there's some cohesion with the tones and the values on these lower abstract shapes. And because it's a smaller area, you just have to watch that the Magnum is not going outside of the lines. It's not the end of the world if it does go outside, but yeah, you have to adjust the angle of the needle in order to stick within those parameters that you've created. So yeah, lots of going one way and then going the other way, cross-hatching, overlaying, whatever you want to call it. Just helps to build a more consistent, even tone. It's going to heal with texture anyway because there's stipple behind it, but you don't want it to look unnecessarily patchy. So by cross-hatching, you're going to achieve a much more fluid transition from soft shading into texture. I think it's important for artists to be able to draw. It's just one of those fundamental skills that you need to have before tattooing. It's good to know, your basic compositions, and to know like some form of realism, where if somebody asks you to draw an elephant or something, that you would be able to draw it from memory. But I do know that people are, learning to tattoo and they have zero drawing skills. And some of them tattoo quite efficiently, but a lot of them are just scratchers and they're tattooing really horrific things. And I think that it actually puts more of a stigma on the tattoo industry because people already had a stigma. Only prison inmates have tattoos and thugs and gang members. So now that we've got scratchers who don't know how to draw thinking that they can tattoo, we're also getting people with more cases of, hepatitis C and other diseases like that come from dirty tattooers. So for me, yeah, it's really important that you know how to draw, or else what even is the point? Okay, so when I'm tattooing, I don't like to wipe the entire stencil with a wet paper towel. I'll only wipe the parts that I've tattooed just so I can see exactly what's been tattooed and how well saturated it is. And if I need to go over anything, I'll do it then. But yeah, it's better to blob or wipe down from where you've already started tattooing, or else the stencil is going to be non-existent. So I've switched needles now. I'm going to be using my Killer Ink 14 round liner. I still hang it out quite a lot because I want that accuracy, but I'm having to dab away some excess ink just so that when I'm tattooing it's not going to hopefully, obscure the line. I'm lubricating the skin with my tattoo butter, dabbing the excess off my 14 round liner. And I'm just going to push the line, so I start by gently easing the needle into the skin, and then I'll maintain a depth, push and pull along the line until I feel like it's well saturated. And it's good if you can do this in a single pass, because you don't want to cause any blowouts. And if you're in the skin for too long in one area, then the ink will bleed out and you'll get a big nasty blowout. So you want to have a stable hand and move slowly, but not too slowly. Just pushing up the way. Just watching the end of my needle. Making sure I'm hitting the right lines. Pulling it down now, steady hand, maintain depth, and you will achieve a consistent saturation in the line. So to fill in this area, because I want that area to be solid, I'm just going to go in with the same liner, back and forward, round in little circular motions. And it doesn't matter if there's ink splatter on this bit, because it's not as precise as creating those lines on the outer parts of this black shape. And sometimes it's good because you can actually dip back into this puddle of ink that's lying on top of the skin instead of dipping back into your ink pot. So it saves a little bit of time, but yeah, make sure that you know where you're tattooing, and again, it helps if you can see where your needle's going. Fat lines like 14RLs, they're easy for me to tattoo with without making any wiggles in the lines, because they're so fat you don't see any imperfections as clearly as you would with a 3RL. So yeah, now I'm just stamping in, pushing firmly, get that ink right in there. And you can hear it and you can feel it. There's a different vibration when it's at the right depth. Okay, now I'm going to cover part of the stencil that I don't want to wipe away. I'm going to give a nice firm wipe so that I can see what's going on. Okay, I'm going to go back in with the 3 and just clean up some of these lines, but also brush in this little part of the stencil that's rubbed off slightly. It's good to do that when you're losing a stencil, just so that it doesn't stress you out later when you're having to make up and you're on the spot just where that detail was supposed to go. So yeah, you can bloodline everything, but I just feel like it wastes time. I would only do it if you have lost a stencil that you're going to work on next. So because I've switched back to the 3RL, I've decreased the volts back down to 4.5. And I can take my time when I'm cleaning up the edges of these lines. I want them to be super precise, because it's really what holds this center part of the design together, the nice bold outlines along the edges. Okay, so I'm going to move on to this quite spongy part of the calf. It's really important that you stretch the skin if you want to maintain a smooth line or tone. So for me, I like to stretch with my 2 fingers here, because I feel like stretching like this way, there's kind of a bubble still in the skin, and because I'm using fine needles, sometimes the needle will just get stuck in that little bubble of skin. So it basically makes the skin a lot more taut for me to work with, and that way the needle doesn't get stuck on the skin and I'm not making any mistakes. Looking to keep these whiskers negative, which means there's going to be no shading in them. It's just the shading that's behind, and that's it. I don't want to get too over complicated with whiskers, because you know, they're not a feature like the eyes or the nose. They're just at the edge of the design, so they're not as important, but I still like to create this nice sort of graphic look with the heavy black and then the negative. Yeah, my needle speed is still pretty slow, 4.5, and I'm just brushing over where the whiskers are so I don't lose them, because there is a lot of information in the design here. I don't want to start guessing where things are when the stencil disappears, so all I'm doing is going over these long lines, just brushing them in, and then I'll fill them in once they've been made permanent. So yeah, I'm still using a nice 2-finger stretch motion, and I'm pushing that needle quite deep into the skin. Obviously not too deep, but probably about 1.5 millimeters, especially when I'm wanting to achieve a dark value and quickly. So I'm doing the fur texture now. When I'm doing fur, I like to sort of keep a firm pressure, but also vary the pressure. So at the start of the whip, I'll maybe have a hard pressure, and then in the middle of the whip, I'll lift my hand up so it's lighter, and then at the end, I will increase the firmness again, just to create lines that have sort of a dark to light to dark again. And what I do is I just layer up with the dots in the same motion. It's a constant contact with the skin, back and forward, alternating depth. And yeah, it creates a nice rounded shape with, you know, a light source in the middle that helps to create the fur curvature. And because it's a raccoon, obviously this part of the fur needs to be quite dark, so I will be layering up a lot of these tones, but I'll have to be careful to not decrease the amount of line work that's in these whips. I don't want just solid background shading. I want to have these liney textures within the fur, just to create a sort of directional flow, which helps to make the piece look a little bit less flat. If I want a more saturated sketchy line, I will just slow down my hand. That's all I need to do. And as you can see, the lines are slightly more defined this way. And it's good when you want to sort of emphasize a little bit of the fur more than the other parts. I think it heals better this way. You have a bit that's nice and dark that's obviously going to hold for longer, but your other parts of the fur will be nice and soft. Sometimes if it's too liney, you can just create a very harsh looking fur, and I don't think it looks like fur then, it just looks like harsh shading. So yeah, preference of mine is just to only bolden up some of the lines in the fur. So this part of the nose, or the cheeks, or whatever you want to call it, I want it to be very light. So basically I won't be shading much of it, only this outer part that's close to the darker fur. Designs look better when you have high contrast or dynamic light source. So if you want to create little wispy lines, you need to have control of both fast and slow hand speeds. Because basically, we're going to have a slow entry into the skin and then a fast exit, just like that. And we have lines with dotwork tails basically. And I think it looks really nice for fur. So the one piece of advice that stuck with me throughout my career was given to me by Grind Design. I don't know if you've heard of this really well-known artist, but yeah, he was doing a guest spot at my old studio, and he basically looked at my stencil and said, "That's far too busy. I've got too much information and there's no room for me to improvise on the skin if I wanted to." So after hearing that, I was like, what? No, I need all this information. I need to make an accurate stencil so that my design then reflects the same thing and my clients know what they're getting. But after sitting on it for a wee while, I realised that yeah, my stencils were absolutely too busy. And as soon as I simplified them and I only concentrated on the areas that needed guidance, and I just made up the rest as I went along, then I found it a much more freeing experience with a lot less pressure added onto it, because the client is only looking at outlines and they're quite basic outlines, so they don't really have any huge expectations for the design at that point. And then once they see the design when it's finished and fully tattooed and I've just made up the parts that were non-existent to begin with, I find that a lot of people are very pleasantly surprised with their tattoos. And yeah, I give that advice to people now when I see that they're making stencils that are just far too busy. They don't need to know where every line is or every dot even. So yeah, that's what I would say to other people as well. Simplify, less is more, and it really is. So a piece of advice I would give to apprentices is to basically study one style that you really enjoy and excel in it. I know a lot of apprentices think that they need to learn everything all at once, but the truth is that when you're an apprentice you have a very basic knowledge of styles and tattooing, so trying to learn everything at once is just so very overwhelming, and you actually don't progress as quickly as you could if you were just focusing on one style and doing it really well. I think after you learn how to do a style well and you're confident with how you use a machine and you know the settings and stuff, then you can experiment with other styles, because you would then have a knowledge of how those styles are possibly implanted into the skin and what goes into them. Learning everything all at once is just not great in my opinion, especially if you don't want to do every style and you only want to, for example, do blackwork. I would recommend only focusing on blackwork, and you'll get really good at it really quickly and hopefully build a clientele that's solely looking for blackwork tattoos. tip for utilizing negative space is if you create a design with a dramatic lighting, say, where there's lots of really deep dark tones and a lot of, you know, very light tones, then the tones that are the lightest, just don't shade them in anything. Because, you know, the skin is useful when you're using lighting in a tattoo. You can use it as a tone. So when I'm doing, like, say for this example, I'm not going to tattoo any of that space, any of this space here, where there's, you know, a white fur on the raccoon. I just feel like if I do too much shading, then the design as a whole is too heavy. There's too much black. So if you want to offset a lot of black tones that you might have in your work, then I would recommend finding areas where the light tones can be used as a negative space, and it just creates a nice balance in your piece. Okay, so sometimes it's useful to come at a tattoo from a different angle. I might not have space on this side to have nice organic flowy fur lines, so if I approach it from a different angle, I can move my wrist in a more freely motion where I'm able to achieve them nice curved textural lines. And it also saves time as well. You're not trying to figure out how to make lines in a motion that's feeling a little bit awkward for your wrist because you're not in the right position. So for the majority of this side, I've been attacking the tattoo from this angle, coming from the left side, and now for the fur at the top of the head, I'm coming from above and down instead of from the side and inwards. If I make the fur texture from this angle, it's going to feel just really awkward. I'm not going to achieve the same appearance as the other fur texture that I've done on that side. And if you want everything consistent, then sometimes you just need to stand up, maneuver, find a different angle to attack your tattoo and make sure that consistency is, you know, well balanced throughout your tattoo. If there's a bit that doesn't look like the other textures, it stands out too much, so you need to be aware of that. Okay, so I'm just coming in with a mag to saturate this area a little bit more evenly. I don't really want too much texture on it, so if I'm using a mag, it creates a more smooth tone. Because I already have quite a lot of texture throughout the design, I don't want it everywhere, so it's good to have some varying textures in your design. It just makes the piece a little bit more interesting to look at. So an example of improvisation in this tattoo is, for example, this area is just squared off. It could be solid black, it could be light tone shading, I could create some kind of funky texture there. It just means that there's space for me to decide on the spot what I would like that area to be. So if I had put like a dotwork texture throughout this as a stencil, then obviously it has to be dotwork because that's what the client's obviously already seen and they've approved. So yeah, I just like leaving some areas open to interpretation basically in the stencil, and it also makes it a lot less stressful for me that I'm not basically scripted to do one thing or the other. I've got free reign to just make up as I go along, and I think that also makes for a more interesting tattoo. It's a lot more organic. So in terms of finding the right needle, it really is just, you know, buy a cartridge, test it out, see how you like it. For me, we had Cheyennes in the shop, So as an apprentice I was already using these machines, so I'm already familiar with them. But this particular Shen cartridge, it has a capillary function, which means that it sucks up the ink in a sort of spiral vortex and then pushes it back down the needle to where it's not going to deposit blobs. It's very controlled, and it's really good if you're using like small details. If you get a blob or splatter coming out of the cartridge, it can totally obscure anything that you're working on, and hence you could make mistakes. So this is probably my favourite needle for doing stipple work, any kind of fine line stuff. It's great. In terms of like fatter needles with larger configurations, I'm not really as pernickety about what ones I'm choosing. I just kind of choose one and use it. Because I have a lot of experience, I've been tattooing for 11 years, so I know how to use needles. And for the ones that are slightly larger, for example 14 round liner, it's not that different from using a 3. I just need to change a few more settings and I'm able to line quite easily with that type of needle. So it's really not a huge deal if it's quadrant, killer ink, stellar, any other types of cartridge out there. They all basically do the same thing, but for my 3s definitely the capillary function is such an innovative design. It really does help when tattooing. This line I want it to be quite sketchy, so what I'll do is I'll push and then lift my needle along different areas of the line just to create a very imperfect consistency. I think that reflects more of what a sketchy line is. I don't want anything too bold, but I really enjoy the texture that these sort of inconsistent gritty lines give to a tattoo in general. So yeah, once you're doing this, make sure you're just unevenly going along the line, pressing up and down, moving in circular motions, moving back and forward, and you'll create some really nice flowy textures. And it also means that the line won't heal fully bold. It will have some patchiness to it, but I think that looks great considering that it's supposed to be sort of an old, eroded line. Okay, so now we're just checking that the lines we did a little while ago are settled in the skin. Sometimes when you're tattooing, the skin goes quite red, so you have to wait a little bit for that to settle before you're able to determine whether or not something like a line or a piece of shading is well saturated. And for example, this little bit here, the skin is quite tough because we're getting close to the knee, so it takes a little bit more effort to make sure that it's shaded well so that it doesn't heal patchy. So I'm just giving it another little going over, and then we'll wait to see how that settles down, and then we'll make our decision then. But there's only so many times that you can go over something before you start to overwork the area. And you'll know if you've overworked an area because it looks very red, raw, and the skin is quite muddled. So if that happens, then you just have to let go of the area so that you don't seriously damage the person's skin. For this part in between the eyebrows, I'm using a long sweeping motion, but also I've got a slight curve in the motion just to convey the curvature of this part of the forehead. I've got my needle hanging quite far out still, and it's just being lightly pressed over these areas of the skin. I don't want too dark of a texture here, but I want dark enough that it's going to contrast nicely with the eyebrows, which I'm leaving quite negative. So for this bit, basically it's just a solid black area with some kind of splatter texture at the top. So all I'm doing is making sure that I know where exactly I'm putting the black. So the stencil rubbed off just a little bit. So what I'm doing is just brushing in where all the black's going to be, and then I will fill it with a magnum. Because it's quite a dense area of black, I want it to be fully saturated, and I don't want to spend too long tattooing it with a 3, so if we get the magnums out, it's going to be a much quicker experience for my client, but also we're going to saturate the skin to a much higher standard. Okay, so I've fully saturated this bit of black on the knee. I'm now just adding texture over it to give the illusion of paint splatter or ink splatter. So I'm just adding little debris coming off of the central area of black, and that just sort of creates the illusion of movement, makes it a nice little dynamic shape at the top of the design where there isn't a whole lot happening. Just got to make sure that central point is well saturated. If not, especially with it being on the knee tends to dry out faster as it heals, so you might end up with patchiness. And if you haven't saturated fully, then your black might also not appear black, it might appear grey because you've not pushed it into the skin hard enough. So if you want to see if something's well saturated, you can just, pour some water over it, and it just helps you see clearly what areas have not been hit yet. Okay, so I'm just going in to the older parts of the tattoo now that I've seen how they've settled. I'm going over with a magnum and I'm just softening out some of these textured areas, and also providing a little bit more depth in the fur. I want it to look nice and soft, and I think that magnums create nice, evenly soft tones to help portray that. I'm also just making sure like my black is black, and then I can move on to the white afterwards. So I'm going to go in with some white now. It's the final stage of the tattoo. I'm using a Stellar 15 round magnum, just small circular motions over this area of the nose that I want highlighted. I don't like putting too much white because it sometimes can make your tattoo look a little bit flat. So if you put it in areas where there would be a natural highlight, for example, noses of animals are usually quite wet, so it makes sense to put a highlight there. It wouldn't make any sense for me to put it in the negative space because it's already contrasted. And I like to put white next to areas that have some deep blacks. And for the eyes, I always just like whiten out the little blind eyeballs. Yeah, I've got 5.5 on the volts, maybe 2mm needle hang, and I'm pushing quite firmly into the skin because white is quite a thick pigment and sometimes it needs a little more effort to go into the skin and be fully saturated. So I'm using the edge of the needle on this magnum to get close to the very edge of my black outline so that there's no space in between and everything sits flush. Okay, so I'm gonna go in with some Yayo cleansing foam. I like to just let this sit on the skin for a little bit, and it helps calm down the redness and obviously cleans the skin so that I can see whether everything's being implanted properly. A nice thick layer, and yeah, we'll just wait a couple of minutes for that. So now that the tattoo is finished, I'm going to prepare it so that she can go home. Basically what I'm using is Yayo butter. I'm just going to apply the butter gently with a spatula stick, making sure it covers the entire tattoo. I like to do this because it keeps the tattoo moisturized and doesn't let it dry out. Because if it dries out, it tends to scab, and if it scabs, it's likely that it will heal patchy. So all we need to do is keep it wrapped up with cling foam for 3 days. And I always tell my clients to wash their tattoos regularly. That means 3 or 4 times a day, going in the shower, washing their tattoo under the shower head, and using either antibacterial soap or a natural soap that's not going to aggravate the skin. Thoroughly clean the tattoo and then rinse off all of the soap. Once they do that, I ask them to pat it dry with a paper towel and then let it air dry for a further 45 minutes to an hour. This allows the skin to breathe before you then put the cream back on and wrap the tattoo back up with cling foam. And basically she'll repeat that process for the next 3 days or so. After 3 days, she'll stop using the cling foam because the skin will basically be closed by then, but she'll continue to moisturize the skin because it will still be flaky and crispy on the top. She'll do that for about 2 weeks before the tattoo is fully healed. And that's the tutorial done, guys. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn anything more about me or my style, please follow me at AlexUnderwood_tattoos. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Killer Ink channel. Ciao.